If today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. When we strive to live that which is good, to do what is right, to live goodness, how do I be a good person? How do I do what's right and good in the world and be a force of good in the world and contribute to light and goodness in the world and not contribute to more darkness and misery in the world? But as we ponder that question, we recognize there are many voices out there in the world, both externally outside of us and within us, telling us what is right or good or the things that we should pursue or prioritize or value. And part of the spiritual life as Christians, our walk with Christ, is to sift out God's voice from all of those voices. To sift out all the voices outside of us and within us, to sift out where is God's voice within all of this, that I can listen and obey that voice. We call that process discernment, to sort of sift through all these various things, these various voices, these various movements within our hearts, to find out what is the authentic movement of God's Spirit, his voice. But then the trick is, we may figure out God's voice, what is truly the voice of goodness. God's voice is the voice of goodness. And then we may come to know that voice, but then the trick is obeying that voice. Sometimes we've had experiences. I know I definitely recall experiences in my childhood when I knew the thing that was right, and I very, very clearly chose to not do it. Yes, I knew I shouldn't lie to my parents about doing my homework, but I didn't want to do it. So when they asked me if it was done, I told them it was. They quickly figured out, though, that I was lying. Apparently, I don't have a knack for being a good liar. So then, how do we then move to obey that voice of goodness? Because as human beings, we tend to be naturally inclined, because of our broken, fallen, sinful human nature, we're inclined towards rebelliousness, towards selfishness. This is sort of at the heart of that rich story of the fall of Adam and Eve. That deeply ingrained in fallen humanity is this idea that I can choose what is good and evil. Adam and Eve ate from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Is I get to decide what is right and good for myself, and I don't need God for that. But the problem is then what we deem as right and good is usually whatever I happen to want most in the moment, and whatever serves me in then getting that. So, of course, the voice of God is to call us to goodness. And not just to get us to follow rules, but to, in fact, transform our hearts, to make us into actually good beings. To sort of have his true heart of love within us. But it's a process, it's a journey. So sometimes we begin with we obey the voice of God because of fear of punishment. Well, I do what I'm told because I don't want to get in trouble. Or because, I do what God commands because I fear the pains of hell. Okay, that's a step towards goodness. But it's not the fullness of what Christ wants for us. We call that imperfect contrition. That I don't do bad or I avoid sin because I'm afraid of the bad consequences that come from that. But then I might say, well, I do what's good because of the reward that I hope for, of the good things that will come from it that may benefit me. Okay, well, that's maybe a step better, the hope of heaven, maybe in the big picture or on the smaller level. But still not quite what we would call perfect contrition, because it's still ultimately measured by myself, what I get out of it. But what Jesus is trying to get us to is what we might call perfect contrition. That I do what is right and good for goodness' sake. That I do it out of genuine love. To do what is right and good simply because I love God. Or because I love my neighbor. Or both at the same time. This is what Jesus is sort of driving at in our gospel today, about just doing what we're told to do and say we are unprofitable servants. That I'm not in it, that I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do because I'm afraid of the punishment, or, what Jesus is really driving at, because I'm expecting something in return, but simply out of love for my master, out of love for God, and out of love for those that I serve. This is the process of transformation that we're called to in the spiritual life. And again, it doesn't happen usually in an instantaneous moment, but it's a process. As we return again and again to that fount of Mass, to His Word in Scripture, to the sacraments, to prayer, that He works in our hearts, bringing us from that imperfect contrition to perfect love. We reflect, by the way, that movement from imperfect to perfect contrition in one of the options that you have when you go to confession of the act of contrition. That, I'm sorry for my sins because I dread the loss of heaven and the pains of hell. But most of all, because they offend you, my God, who are all good and deserving of all my love. Now, we might ask, how exactly do we start moving along this process? Prayer, of course, and all those things I said. But our gospel reading today, what's noteworthy, is what is in the Gospel of Luke right before and right after the passage that we heard today. Because right before the passage we heard today, there's a conversation the disciples had with Jesus about forgiveness. Well, how many times should we forgive? 7 times? Jesus says, every time a brother wrongs you, if he comes to you and is sorry, to forgive him. And then immediately after this story, or the passage we have today, is the story of the 10 lepers, which we'll hear next week. You probably remember the story. 10 lepers came to Jesus, were healed, they went away. One of them came back and gave thanks. And I think it puts this in context of reminding us that everything we have in our life is sheer gift of God. That we are recipients of His forgiveness and mercy. That we forgive and show mercy because we first received forgiveness and mercy. We give His gift because everything we have in our life is sheer gift. And I think that helps us. That understanding helps us to hear and obey the voice of God and to move to that place of genuine love. When I recognize that everything I have and am from the Lord is sheer gift, I tend to stop living with this idea of that I'm owed something, that I'm doing this thing that's right because I expect something in return, but sheerly out of genuine gratitude, humble, grateful love. To live my life as a response to the love first shown to me, which we continue to know that love as we return again and again to that place of prayer, to Mass, to the sacraments, to hear the voice, the love of God for us. And that our life is to live in response to that. We are unprofitable servants, but unprofitable servants overwhelmed by the wondrous love, the gracious goodness, the gracious gift of life, of redemption, of everything in our lives given to us from God Himself. So if today you hear His voice, harden not your hearts.